Widowed farmer finds young pregnant nun fainted on the dirt road. Comment telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and tell me what city you are watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story, and I want to get to know you better, so subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The rain didn't give any warning that it was coming. It simply poured down, just like the things that change a life forever. I was riding back from the back 40 of the property when the sky just fell out all at once, and the red clay of the dirt road started swallowing my horse's hooves, while the wind whipped the rain sideways, soaking absolutely everything. I pulled my Stetson down further and spurred the animal onward, because the back fence had been fixed and the day's work was done. So now it was just a matter of getting home to change clothes and sit on the porch until exhaustion called for bed. That was when I saw the dark spot in the middle of the path, which from afar looked like a pile of discarded rags, but up close looked like a person. I pulled the reins, and the horse stopped tensely with its ears perked forward, and I just kept looking from there with the rain beating against my face, wondering if that was my problem or not. It wasn't, as it never was, because I had learned to avoid other people's trouble a long time ago. I nudged the horse again, determined to keep going, but something made me look back, and that was when I saw the wet habit clinging to her body. I dismounted slowly, with my boots sinking into the mud, got closer, and saw it was a young woman with a mud-streaked face, a busted lip, and closed eyes, and a belly so round it was impossible to miss. A pregnant nun, all alone, collapsed in the middle of the dirt road that cut through my land. I touched her shoulder lightly but got no response, so I pressed my fingers to her neck, looking for a pulse, and it was there, faint but present. I looked up at the gray sky, at nothing, as if hoping someone would tell me what to do. But all I got was more rain. I carefully carried her to the horse, which was getting nervous, feeling the strange weight, and I had to speak softly to him while settling the young woman in the saddle. I held her tight against me and mounted behind her, guiding the animal back home, but the rain was falling so hard I could barely see 10 feet ahead. It was going up the embankment that everything went wrong. As the horse lost its footing in the mud, its front hoof slipped, and it fell hard on its side with a whinny that pierced the sound of the rain. I managed to jump clear in time, holding the girl against my chest, but the poor beast stayed down, trying to get up and falling right back. I could tell instantly the leg was twisted, which hit me hard since I had spent 10 years riding that horse, 10 years with no other company but him, and now he was there limping because of me. It took me nearly an hour to walk the rest of the way home, carrying the girl in my arms and leading the horse by the reins. When I finally pushed the kitchen door open with my shoulder, Martha dropped the pot on the stove and screamed my name, Henry, asking what on earth had happened. I answered with an exhausted voice that I had found her on the road and that she was alive, but I didn't know for how much longer. Martha is a sturdy 60-year-old woman, tough as an old oak tree, and she has worked here since before Mary died, so she didn't ask any more questions. She just grabbed clean towels, prepared the guest room that no one had stepped foot in for years, and helped me lay the girl on the bed. I took off my muddy boots and just stood there dripping water onto the hardwood floor, not really knowing what to do next. The girl didn't wake up that night, nor the next, while Martha cared for her, changing the damp rags on her forehead, wiping the mud from her face and hands, and covering her with a clean quilt. I stayed out on the porch chain-smoking cigarettes, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof, and trying to make sense of what my front door. It had been 5 years since Mary passed away, 5 years since I had decided that the world could go on without me, and I could go on without it. Resurrection Ranch, a name I always found rather ironic, was 25 miles from the nearest town, making neighbors a rarity and visitors even scarcer. My life consisted of waking up before dawn, working the land until dark, and going to sleep carrying the heavy burden of an oath I had made but failed to keep. I had promised Mary on the day she was buried that I would look after her people, but I had no idea who they were, as she had left no children, and her family was small, scattered, and full of folks who simply vanished after the wake. I honestly thought the promise had died right along with her, until this girl collapsed in the middle of my dirt road. It was on the third night that she finally opened her eyes, and Martha came to get me, with her eyes wide open, saying the girl had woken up but wasn't speaking, just staring. I walked into the room slowly and saw her sitting on the bed with her back against the wall, gazing out the window without even turning her head or moving a muscle when I entered. I called out to her, my voice sounding rougher than I intended, asking if she was okay, but I was met with pure silence. I asked if she needed anything, like water or food, but still got nothing. Martha walked in behind me, holding a bowl of warm broth, and sat on the edge of the bed without any rush, because she has this way of waiting, of never forcing things, knowing that some silence is born of fear rather than choice. She introduced herself calmly as Martha and told the girl my name was Henry, assuring her that she was on his ranch and perfectly safe here. The girl blinked slowly, and then, without even looking at us, she whispered the name Emily. That was all she said, but it was enough. In the days that followed, Emily began to move around the house, always slowly and always quietly, helping Martha in the kitchen without asking permission, washing her own clothes, and sitting on the porch staring at the horizon, like someone waiting for something she knows will never arrive. I kept my distance, never asking questions and never forcing conversation, but it was impossible not to notice the heavy burden she carried, which wasn't just her pregnant belly, but something else that lingered in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. It was Martha who finally coaxed the first real words out of her, sitting beside Emily on a rainless afternoon with 2 mugs of black coffee and simply staying there. She didn't ask a thing or rush the moment, she just stayed. And slowly Emily began to talk about a convent over in Oakhaven, about fleeing in the dead of night, and about a name she hesitated to say, but finally let out like a forced confession: Richard Sterling. Martha turned pale instantly, and even though I was on the other end of the porch fixing a leather strap, I heard it and felt the very ground shake beneath my boots. Richard Sterling was the most powerful man in the county, owner of the local sugar mill, vast farmlands, and plenty of people, being far too young for that much power and far too cunning to be trusted. He was a man who rewrote his own history as easily as one mends an old broken fence, standing today as a respected businessman and church benefactor. But back in the day, he was something else entirely, and Mary had known him well. Martha came looking for me after Emily went to sleep, sitting down beside me on the porch with trembling hands to tell me that the young woman in there was Mary's cousin. I stopped breathing and asked what she meant, and she explained that Emily was the daughter of Mary's sister, the one who disappeared years ago. She said Mary used to talk about her all the time, always saying she was going to go get the girl and take her away from that broken home. But she never had the time. I closed my eyes and felt 5 years of heavy guilt crash down on my shoulders all at once, remembering the oath to look after her people. Emily wasn't a stranger. She was all that was left of a family I had failed to protect. I spent the entire night sitting right there in my rocking chair, listening to the wind howl through the wire fences, realizing that the past had finally come knocking on my door. And this time I couldn't pretend I wasn't home. Richard Sterling wasn't just any name. He was the man who had promised to marry Mary before I did. The man who dumped her the second something better came along, like a wealthier woman and an easier future. This wasn't a coincidence. It was fate coming to collect its dues with interest. The following days were strange, not because of Emily's presence, since I'd already grown used to her silence and her way of walking along the edges of the house like she was apologizing for existing. The strange part was feeling the ranch change, as if someone had flipped a switch on a light that had been left in the dark for way too long. Martha cooked more often, while Emily helped fold the laundry, watered the potted plants on the porch, and fed the chickens, which were just small chores, but they made the old house feel alive again. That bothered me deeply, because I had built my peace in the emptiness and the silence. And now that silence was being filled, I avoided being near her, not because I didn't want to help, but because I simply didn't know how. As every time our eyes met, I saw Mary. Not in her face, since Emily was different, younger and more fragile, but in her mannerisms. Like the way she furrowed her brow when she was deep in thought, or how she held her coffee mug with both hands. Those little gestures reminded me of the woman I had lost, and it hurt like hell. It was Luke, the youngest ranch hand on the payroll, who brought the first sign that things weren't going to stay peaceful. He showed up on the porch on a hot, sunny morning, holding his hat in his hands and looking real sheepish, asking if he could have a word with me. I told him to go ahead, and he explained that he was down at the general store in town the day before, and folks were asking about the girl staying up here. I felt my entire body tense up and asked who exactly was asking, to which he replied it was just regular townsfolk like Joe from the hardware store and Mrs. Higgins, and he swore he only told them I had helped a sick girl I found on the road and nothing more. I repeated his words, saying just that, with my voice coming out colder than I wanted. Luke swallowed hard and asked if he had done wrong, and I lied, telling him no and dismissing him back to work. He hurried off, feeling the heavy weight of my answer, while I stood there staring at the dirt road, cutting through my property, knowing the information was already out there. Out here in the country, loose information quickly turns into gossip, and gossip turns into a twisted truth before you can even blink. It didn't take long, because 3 days later, a man showed up at the front gate, not riding a horse or driving a beat-up truck, but behind the wheel of a black sedan that was far too clean for a dirt road, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He stepped out slowly, adjusted his tie, and walked up to the porch like he already owned the place, greeting me with a polite, almost gentle voice, asking if I was Henry. I confirmed I was and asked who he might be, to which he introduced himself as Albert, claiming to be a social worker from the county office who received a tip about a vulnerable young woman on the property and came to check on her well-being. Martha was in the kitchen and immediately stopped washing the dishes, and Emily, who was sitting in the bedroom, must have heard it too, because the silence in the house grew incredibly heavy. I crossed my arms and told him she was doing just fine, and he smiled, saying he was glad to hear that, but insisted that protocol required him to see her in person just to make sure everything was all right. I bluntly told him that wouldn't be necessary, and his smile wavered as he tried to explain that he understood my concern, but it was a legal matter and he had an obligation. I cut him off, demanding to see his county badge, which made him hesitate before digging into his pocket and pulling out a plain business card with just his name printed on it and no official county seal whatsoever. I handed it back, stating that it wasn't a county badge, and he sighed, saying we were getting off on the wrong foot and that he was only there to help. I told him he could help by getting off my property, and that was when his fake smile vanished completely, replaced by the look of a man used to getting whatever he wants and turning nasty when he doesn't. He warned me I was going to regret this, and I fired back that I had regretted plenty of things in my life, and one more wouldn't make a damn difference. He got back into his fancy car, slammed the door shut, and sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust. Martha stepped out onto the porch with a pale face, whispering that the man wasn't from the county, and I told her I knew that. She asked who sent him, and I just stared out at the empty road, feeling the noose starting to tighten, and muttered the name Richard. That night, I finally sat down to talk with Emily for the first time, finding her on the porch staring up at the dark, star-filled sky, with her hands resting gently on her belly. I told her straight out that she needed to tell me what had happened, because things were about to get a whole lot worse, and I needed to know exactly what I was up against. She stayed completely silent for a long time, but then, without even looking at me, she began to pour her heart out, explaining how she had joined the convent at 17 to escape a family that completely fell apart after her mother vanished. She talked about finding true peace in that place, in the daily prayers and the quiet work, until Richard showed up at a spiritual retreat he was funding, all smiles and generosity, claiming he wanted to help the diocese. Her voice broke as she said he recognized her, telling her he knew her from when she was just a little girl, and that he was a dear friend of her cousin Mary. My chest tightened as I asked what happened next, and she explained that he started coming around more often, always making up some excuse to bring donations, chat with the Mother Superior, or linger after Mass, until one day he asked to speak with her completely alone. She paused and took a deep, trembling breath, saying she didn't want to do it, but Mother Superior Margaret insisted it would be deeply disrespectful to refuse their biggest benefactor, so she went. She said he didn't give her any choice, and I clenched my fists tight, demanding to know if he had physically hurt her. She slowly shook her head, explaining it wasn't the way I was thinking, because he didn't have to use force when he had absolute power and endless money, while she had absolutely nothing. When she finally realized she was pregnant, Mother Superior Margaret called her into the office and told her she needed to take care of the problem very discreetly or leave the convent for good. So she ran, her voice cracking as she repeated that she fled, grabbing the few things she owned and walking down the highway without knowing where to go, only knowing she couldn't stay there. She finally looked at me with eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall, and told me that was when I found her and saved her life. I stared right back, feeling the crushing weight of her words, knowing I was no hero and never had been. But in that exact moment, I understood I had a clear choice to make. I could either throw her back to the wolves and pretend none of this ever happened, or I could finally honor the sacred oath I made to Mary. I promised her right then and there that nobody was going to take her away from my ranch, and it wasn't some empty promise. It was an ironclad decision. In the days that followed, the pressure started closing in from all sides, starting with Arthur, a neighboring rancher who showed up with a message. He's a good man, but easily spooked, owing favors to a lot of powerful people, and Richard was at the top of that list. He spoke in a low, almost ashamed tone, telling me he came as a friend and that Richard wanted me to think long and hard about what I was doing. I told him I was thinking just fine, but he warned me that Richard was incredibly powerful and could completely ruin me if he wanted to. I dared him to try, and Arthur just shook his head in defeat, calling me a stubborn old fool like I had always been. I shot back that he had always been too much of a coward, but I didn't judge him because every man carries the weight he can handle. He rode off looking down at the dirt, and I went right back to work, but the threat had been delivered loud and clear. It was Martha who brought the absolute worst news, returning from town with red, teary eyes and a crumpled piece of paper clutched in her hand. She told me I needed to see it, and it turned out to be a legal document filing for Emily's institutionalization, citing severe mental instability, emotional distress, and claiming she was a danger to herself, signed by doctors who had never even laid eyes on her. I asked her with a voice shaking with rage how she had gotten her hands on it, and she said Rachel down at the pharmacy found it left behind at the county clerk's office, either by accident or left there on purpose just to scare us. Reading that vile document felt like taking a hard punch straight to the gut, because I instantly understood Richard's sick strategy. He wasn't going to try and take Emily by force. He was going to completely destroy her credibility before she ever got the chance to speak out, painting her as a crazy, lying problem, so that when nobody believed her anymore, he could do whatever he pleased. I walked straight to the guest room and knocked, telling Emily to open up, and she did so slowly, with a terrified look on her face. She asked what was wrong, and I just held up the paperwork, telling her this was Richard's doing. She read it, and I physically saw something inside her shatter, watching the tiny sliver of hope that had started to grow just die right there on the spot. She whispered that she knew he would do something like this, but I promised her he wasn't going to win. She argued that I just didn't understand, because men like him always win, and I swore to her that this time he wouldn't. But as she closed the door, and I stepped back out onto the porch, staring out into the pitch-black night swallowing the ranch, I wasn't entirely sure of anything, only knowing the net was closing fast, and I had to act before it was too late. It was early Sunday morning before dawn, when everything went entirely off the rails, as Emily woke up screaming in agonizing pain. Martha had tried explaining the normal pains of pregnancy to me like I'd understand, but these were entirely different, fierce and relentless. Martha rushed into my room at 5 in the morning looking absolutely frantic, telling me Emily needed a doctor right that second. I told her I would ride into town and fetch Dr. Miller, but she said there was no time for that. I looked over at Emily writhing on the bed, her face ghost white and her knuckles white, gripping the bed sheets, fighting back screams, but showing the sheer agony in her eyes. I asked Martha how much time we realistically had, and she admitted she didn't know, but it looked incredibly grim. I rushed out and saddled my horse, who was still favoring that bad leg, but having improved slightly, though not enough for a hard gallop into town. Still, I had absolutely no other option. So I mounted up and spurred him hard, pushing through the jarring, uneven gait that sent shocks up my spine with every stride. That dirt road had never felt so impossibly long, and by the time I hit the town limits, the sun hadn't even started to peek over the horizon. Dr. Miller lived in an old 2-story wooden house right on Main Street with a faded wooden sign out front, and I hammered on his front door until my knuckles bled. Getting no answer, I banged on it again until the upstairs window finally slid open and the doctor poked his head out, wearing a bathrobe and crooked glasses, angrily asking who it was. I yelled my name and told him I was from Resurrection Ranch and that it was a dire medical emergency. He grumbled, but came downstairs quickly, taking one look at my panicked face and realizing this wasn't the time for silly questions. So he grabbed his black leather medical bag, hopped onto the spare horse I had dragged along, and we tore off back down the road. But halfway there, the doctor suddenly pulled hard on his reins and yelled for me to stop. I yelled back, asking what the hell was wrong, and he said he needed to tell me something before we got to the ranch. I told him to spit it out fast, and he admitted he had been hearing awful rumors about the girl I was sheltering. My stomach tied itself into a knot as I asked what that had to do with anything, and he explained that important people in town were saying she was deeply disturbed, that she had escaped a psychiatric ward, and that I was being completely conned. I barked at him that I didn't have time for idle town gossip, but he shot back that it wasn't gossip, it was a severe warning, and if he went out there and helped her, folks would say he was aiding a fugitive or a lunatic, and he had a family and a practice to protect and simply couldn't afford the risk. I cut him off with a voice as cold as absolute zero, reminding him that he took a sacred oath as cold as absolute zero, reminding him that he took a sacred oath to help anyone in need, and asked if that was all just a big lie. He sat there in total silence for a few seconds, then spurred his horse forward without uttering another word. When we finally slid to a halt at the ranch, Martha was waiting on the porch wringing her hands, thanking God we made it, and telling the doctor the girl was fading fast. Doctor. Miller rushed into the bedroom and slammed the door shut, leaving me pacing back and forth in the hallway, listening to Emily's muffled cries of pain, Martha's soothing whispers, and the heavy, terrifying silence of the doctor working desperately to save a life. An hour dragged by, then 2, and the sun was already blazing high in the sky when the bedroom door finally creaked open. The doctor stepped out, wiping his bloody hands on a towel, looking aged and exhausted, but he looked me in the eye and said she was going to pull through. though it was a damn close call, and if we had been even 30 minutes later, he wasn't sure he could have done a thing. I felt my knees actually buckle and asked about the baby, and he assured me the child was still safe. But Emily needed absolute uncompromising bed rest with zero stress and zero physical effort. He also warned me that she needed proper medical monitoring and he couldn't keep riding out to the middle of nowhere every week, so I had to bring her into town. I told him flat out that I couldn't do that, and when he asked why, I told him she simply wasn't safe there. The doctor looked at me with that specific expression of a man who desperately wants to know the truth, but is utterly terrified of the answer. I told him he didn't want to know what was going on, so he packed up his instruments, took the double payment I forced into his hand, and rode away without ever looking back, knowing he had done the righteous thing, but also knowing he was probably going to pay a steep price for it. For the next several days, Emily stayed confined to her bed, while Martha doted on her like she was her own flesh and blood. And I stayed out on the porch, working quietly but keeping a hawk's eye on the dirt road, knowing damn well Richard wouldn't just give up. And I was dead right, though his next attack came from an angle I never saw coming. The local county radio station broadcast a breaking news alert right in the middle of their morning country music program, and Martha heard it and came sprinting out to the porch, looking like she'd seen a ghost, screaming for me to turn on the radio right that second. I cranked the knob on the battered old radio, sitting on the kitchen counter, and heard Rachel, the local news anchor, reading a disturbing report about suspicious activities out in the rural county limits, claiming locals were deeply concerned about the erratic behavior of a young woman who had abandoned her strict religious duties and was now causing dangerous disturbances on a local farm, adding that authorities were keeping a very close watch on the situation. I twisted the radio knob off so violently it nearly snapped in my fingers. Emily had heard every word, standing weakly in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, with silent tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She whispered brokenly that they were going to destroy everything and make the whole world believe she was the villain. I promised her they wouldn't, but the sheer blinding rage in my own voice made even me doubt my own words. That was the exact moment I remembered the old leather-bound journal. Mary used to keep a weathered, hardcover notebook where she meticulously documented absolutely everything, from passing thoughts to names, dates, and dangerous secrets she knew but never had the courage to say out loud. After she passed, I had shoved that journal into the deepest, darkest corner of a drawer and never opened it again because the memories hurt far too much. But right now, I needed it more than oxygen. I tore my bedroom apart until I found it. Its pages yellowed with age, but Mary's elegant handwriting still perfectly legible. And right there, buried in the middle of her notes, was the name Richard Sterling. Mary had written it all down in agonizing detail, detailing the broken promises he made, the wedding he completely abandoned, the massive tracts of land he bought with dirty money nobody could trace, and the heartbreaking truth about her missing cousin, Emily's mother, explicitly detailing how Richard was deeply, criminally involved in her sudden disappearance. There was even a drafted letter she never found the courage to mail, addressed directly to the district attorney, laying out every single crime, but fear had kept her silent. I gripped that fragile notebook with both hands and felt the immense weight of the truth radiating from it, knowing this could either fix everything or burn our entire world to ashes. The very next morning, I drove my old truck straight into town and stormed into the radio station without bothering to knock. Rachel was sitting in the broadcasting booth, shuffling through papers, and nearly jumped out of her skin when she saw me standing there. She stammered that I couldn't just barge in, but I cut her off by slamming the journal down on her desk, telling her that before she broadcasted another damn lie, she needed to read that. She looked at me in total confusion, opened the notebook, And I watched the exact moment comprehension dawned on her face, her eyes going wide as saucers and all the color draining from her cheeks. She gasped out loud, and I just nodded, telling her that the next time some powerful man asked her to drag an innocent girl's name through the mud, she better think twice, because the truth is, the truth and lies can't hold up forever. I walked out of the station without waiting for a reply, knowing I had just lit a very short fuse. The massive explosion finally hit on Sunday. Richard attended morning mass, sitting right in the front pew like he owned the place, flashing his $1,000,000 smile at everyone, shaking the priest's hand, and acting like a saint. Martha had gone to service and came back trembling like a leaf, telling me that he had purposely sat right next to her in the middle of the sermon and leaned over to whisper directly into her ear. I asked what the bastard had said, and she choked back a sob, saying he told her he didn't have any beef with me, that the girl was the only problem, and if she wasn't gone from the ranch very soon, things were going to get incredibly ugly. I looked into Martha's eyes and saw genuine, paralyzing terror, the exact kind of fear that makes good, honest folks give up the fight. I asked if she wanted Emily to leave, and she squared her shoulders, stating firmly that she wanted her to stay, but admitted she was terrified beyond belief. I confessed I was scared too, but reminded her that fear has never been a good enough reason to stop doing the right thing. It was later that exact same night that Jacob showed up out of nowhere. He was a scrawny, hollow-eyed man who had worked the fields for Richard years ago and got fired without seeing a dime of his final pay. He banged on the front gate in the pitch black of night, begging to speak with me. He spoke in a hushed, paranoid whisper, saying he knew exactly what Richard was trying to do to the girl, and claimed he had something that could blow the whole thing wide open. I asked what it was, and he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper, an old notarized legal document from 10 years ago. He explained that back when Emily was just a minor, Richard had legally signed on as her temporary guardian, appointed by her broken family, and he probably thought everyone had forgotten. But Jacob remembered because he had been forced to sign as a witness. I took the document with trembling fingers, staring at the absolute undeniable proof, the direct legal link and responsibility that Richard had tried so desperately to erase from existence. I asked Jacob why he had held onto it for a decade, and he smiled a bitter, toothless smile, saying he always knew Richard would screw up one day, and he wanted to be ready when the hammer fell. I locked that document away right next to Mary's journal, now armed with 2 loaded weapons, but I knew I had to pull, and cunning men don't go down easy, though every man has a fatal weak point, and I was dead set on exposing his. The golden opportunity presented itself on a Tuesday when news broke that Richard was hosting a massive public town hall meeting at the city council chambers. It was billed as a public accountability forum, according to the glossy flyers plastered all over town, where he planned to brag about his charitable donations, his public works, and his deep, unwavering commitment to the community. And the local radio station was going to broadcast the whole circus live. Martha handed me a flyer with her lips pressed in a tight, angry line, saying he was going to use this grandstand to completely scrub his reputation clean, talk pretty, and make the whole town forget any nasty rumors. I stared at the paper and said, "Not if I get there first." She grabbed my arm and pleaded with me not to face him alone, and I looked over at Emily sitting peacefully on the porch, her hands resting protectively over her belly, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line. She had recovered beautifully since her medical scare, and Dr. Miller had even sneaked out once more, looking annoyed, but confirming she and the baby were perfectly stable, though he stressed again that she needed absolute peace. Peace was the one single thing I couldn't give her right now. I walked over and sat on the wooden steps right beside her, telling her I needed her to trust me implicitly. She looked at me with exhausted eyes and said she did, so I told her she had to be incredibly strong just one last time, because the time had finally come to end this nightmare for good. She asked how, and I told her she was riding into town with me to tell the absolute truth in front of God and everyone. I saw the sheer terror flash across her face, but I also saw something else burning deep down inside her, a fierce, protective courage just waiting to be unleashed. She whispered that he would destroy her, and I told her he could only do that if she let him. She took a deep, shuddering breath, nodded her head with newfound resolve, and said she would go. On the day of the town hall meeting, I put on my cleanest pair of jeans and my best flannel shirt, dusted off my Stetson, and helped Emily climb up into the passenger seat of my old truck. Martha adamantly refused to stay behind, declaring she absolutely wouldn't let us walk into the lion's den alone. I tucked Mary's journal, the guardian document from Jacob, and a burning certainty deep in my chest pocket. Today I would either win this war or lose everything I held dear. The town hall was packed to the rafters, with sweaty folk standing shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, spilling out the double doors and onto the front steps. Richard was sitting smugly at the center of the main panel table, wearing a tailored three-piece suit and a blindingly white smile, flanked by local councilmen who looked like well-fed lapdogs begging for scraps. The table was adorned with fresh flower, wearing a tailored three-piece suit and a blindingly white smile, flanked by local councilmen who looked like well-fed lapdogs begging for scraps. The table was adorned with fresh flower arrangements, crystal water pitchers, and expensive microphones, making it look like a perfectly orchestrated theater production. When I pushed through the heavy back doors, with Emily walking bravely by my side, I physically felt the shocked murmurs ripple through the packed room like an icy winter breeze. Hundreds of heads whipped around, and every single eye locked onto her. Staring at her pregnant belly and the invisible nun's habit everyone still imagined her wearing. Richard spotted me, and for the very first time, his arrogant smile violently twitched and vanished. Mayor Thomas, an old, corrupt politician, aggressively banged his wooden gavel demanding order and silence so the meeting could commence. Richard stood up, adjusted his silk tie, leaned into the microphone, and began preaching about civic duty, moral values, and all the wonderful, selfless things he had done for Oakhaven. His voice was smooth, highly rehearsed, and sickeningly convincing, proving he knew exactly how to manipulate a crowd into eating out of the palm of his hand. I waited patiently for him to finish his grand opening monologue, and the second he paused to take a sip of water, I stood up tall. I called out to Mayor Thomas, asking if I could have the floor, and the old politician scowled, stating firmly that this was a structured panel and not an open public forum for folks like me. I told him I wasn't there to give a speech, I was just there to deliver some reading material. I strode straight down the center aisle, slammed Mary's journal, Jacob's notarized document, and the unmailed letter right down on the table, directly in front of the mayor. He picked them up with a confused frown, but as he quickly scanned the pages, all the blood drained from his face, and his jaw practically hit the floor. He asked what in God's name this was, and I loudly declared it was the truth, the kind of truth that should have seen the light of day a decade ago. Richard leaped to his feet, his face flushed with panicked anger, shouting into the mic that this was a pathetic, coordinated stunt to derail a civic event, and aggressively demanding that security throw me out immediately. I stood my ground, my voice booming louder and far steadier than I ever thought possible, and demanded that Richard Sterling explain to the entire town exactly why he signed legal papers taking custody of a minor 10 years ago. And more importantly, explain exactly what he did when that same girl miraculously turned up pregnant in the very convent he bankrolled. The silence that slammed down on that crowded room was so absolute, you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Richard tried to force a dismissive laugh, but it sounded strangled and pathetic, as he stammered that the accusations were utterly ridiculous and he didn't have to defend himself against forged garbage brought in by a jealous, bitter old farmer. But before he could regain control, Rachel, the journalist, sprang up from the press row at the back of the room, holding her live broadcasting microphone high in the air, and asked loudly if Mr. Sterling was officially denying that he even knew Emily. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but that tiny flinch was all it took. He nervously babbled that he was a busy man who knew hundreds of people and couldn't possibly remember everyone. Rachel pressed harder, asking if he denied being her legal guardian when she was 15. He started sweating profusely, claiming it was just a minor legal favor for a troubled family and absolutely nothing more. Rachel didn't let up, shouting over the crowd to ask if he denied having secret, unchaperoned meetings with her at the Oakhaven convent over the last few months. Richard opened his mouth to lie, but his voice completely failed him, and he just stood there, opening and closing his mouth like a suffocating fish. The entire town was staring at him in horrified realization, and for the first time in his pampered life, the great Richard Sterling didn't have a slick answer ready to go. Then Emily stood up. Her knees were visibly knocking together, but she stood tall and proud, declaring with a soft but fiercely unwavering voice that she was going to speak. I whispered for her not to push herself, but she told me she had to do this. And she slowly walked down the aisle, each step heavy with purpose, until she reached the front and stared straight into Richard's terrified eyes. He cowardly looked away, unable to meet her gaze, as she leaned into a microphone and introduced herself to the dead silent room as Emily, explaining that she joined the convent at 17 because she had absolutely nobody left in the world after her mother vanished and her family shattered. She pointed a shaking but accusatory finger dead at Richard, telling the crowd that this man was the one who signed as her guardian when she was a child, promising to protect her. But when she grew up and devoted her life to God, he showed up again, not to help, but to steal everything she had left. Her voice wobbled but never broke as she confessed that when she discovered she was pregnant, the Mother Superior, who was deeply in Richard's debt, ordered her to make the problem quietly disappear or hit the road. She proudly stated she chose to run, and if it hadn't been for Henry taking her in, she would have died in a ditch on the side of the road. Richard slammed his fists on the table, desperately screaming that she was a crazy, lying extortionist trying to ruin his flawless reputation for a quick payday. Rachel immediately fired back, waving the notarized document in the air, demanding he explain why he hid the paperwork, why he kept his guardianship a total secret, and why a supposedly upstanding citizen would cover up such a massive conflict of interest. Richard looked around wildly like a cornered rat begging for a lifeline, but the councilman was shrinking away from him. The crowd was glaring at him with pure disgust, and even his closest cronies had practically melted into the walls. Mayor Thomas weakly banged his gavel and asked if Mr. Sterling had any logical defense for these damning documents. Richard took a ragged, shuddering breath, and the pristine, untouchable mask finally slipped off, revealing a pathetic, terrified little man hiding underneath. He completely broke down, whimpering into the mic that he only ever wanted to help her. Emily stared him down and called him a liar, and that single word struck him like a physical blow, effectively ending his reign of terror right then and there. The meeting immediately devolved into absolute chaotic pandemonium, with screaming citizens and flashing cameras, while Richard scurried out the side exit, surrounded by his panicked lawyers, desperately trying to shield his face from the onslaught of unanswerable questions Rachel kept hurling at him live on the air. Through all the screaming madness, Emily finally collapsed safely into Martha's loving arms, sobbing out all the pain, terror, and poison she had kept locked inside for so many tortuous months. Several weeks later, Emily packed her bags and left the ranch. She didn't leave because I told her to, or because she was running scared, but because she had finally found a truly safe haven, a beautiful sanctuary run by a completely different order of nuns, far away from Oakhaven, far away from Richard, and far away from all the devastating trauma that had nearly destroyed her. On the crisp morning she left, she stopped right at the front gate of the property and looked back at the old farmhouse. The bright morning sun illuminated her face, and for the very first time since I found her battered in the mud, she offered a genuine, radiant smile. She told me Mary was absolutely right to trust me, and I couldn't even force a word past the thick lump in my throat, so I just tipped my